This video is brought to you by Skillshare, by Audible, by Squarespace, by 17 different mobile apps and gaming devices. My goal during this coronavirus outbreak is to get paid. Anyway, hope you guys see, oh, that's a cold. Nothing worse than when there's a global pandemic than to have a slight cold, because every time you breathe, you're thinking, oh no, do I actually have it? I'm like 99.9% sure I don't have it, but you never know. Anyway, turns out I never made a video lecture for this chapter, so I'm going to do it right now. I'm not going to use any notes. I'm going to go off the top of my head, so we'll see how accurate this is. But since you're all reading your textbook anyway, you're probably going to be fine, right? Right. So let's dive in and discuss the politics of the 1960s, specifically JFK's short presidency, and then we'll talk about what happens in the wake of JFK's assassination. Spoiler alert. All right, where we left off. So the 1950s are a cooling off period of the Cold War. Stalin's dead, and there's a power struggle in Russia because of his death. Our foreign policy is about the containment of communism. Remember, we want to stop the growth of communism. We don't want it to spread anywhere. Eisenhower has just left office, and he is warned of a military-industrial complex. There's some big, giant, crazy conspiracy going on that we talked about before. And then Americans are afraid of communism, so they're acting overly patriotic. That way, their opinions or whatever beliefs are like above reproach. No one would ever accuse them of being a communist. But remember, we're probably all communists. Kind of like how we're probably all sick with this coronavirus. That's a good teaching technique right there. Taking a past event and relating it to something current. Teacher of the year. A short year. Because, school's canceled. Or not. Who knows? It'll be fun. Let's keep going. So, the election of 1960. In this election, we have a difficult problem because the old establishment are basically all either retired, unable to run for president again, or dead. So the election of 1960 is going to be a really interesting election because we're going to have a series of new candidates that kind of represent the youth movement in America in a way. Uh, Both JFK and Richard Nixon are relatively young in comparison to previous presidents. They both have young children, and they both kind of represent this youthful movement that America is moving towards. JFK is the son of one of the richest men in America, so as we know, that makes him perfectly qualified to be president. And he is youthful, he's exuberant, he's a World War II veteran. However, he is putting on a show. He's actually borderline crippled due to back injuries suffered in World War II, and he also has a series of other ailments his entire life. In fact, he's read his last rites 3 times by a priest before he even becomes president. Like no one thought he'd live as long as he did. His biggest, well, not his biggest, but the one of the biggest concerns of the time period is that he is a Roman Catholic. Now, it's not that Americans hate Catholics or anything like that, but this is a nation that was founded by Protestants, and Protestantism is a big part of the national identity of the United States. The concern was that if JFK becomes president, now we might have to listen to the Pope, or the Pope might have authority over America. It's almost like the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, but with God. So that's going to be a bit of an issue for a lot of Americans. His opponent is going to be this dude named Richard Milhouse Nixon. And yes, his middle name is Milhouse. Now, Nixon is he's the current vice president. So if you liked the economy of the 1950s, you liked the American security and American foreign domination in the 1950s, you want to keep that party rolling, Nixon is the guy. He's the current vice president. He has a life in politics, not born to a wealthy family, but he has a life in politics, and he's dedicated his life to public service. And again, current vice president of one of the most successful administrations we've had so far. So, if you want to keep the party rolling, you got to go with Nixon. Now, the thing is, and as we have discussed, the political parties are not as far apart at this time period as they are today. In fact, the political parties are on the merge of almost kind of switching positions. Um, and in the middle of all this, at this time period, we have to kind of define what the political parties are because they're actually kind of similar to each other in a lot of ways. Hence the idea of these televised debates. The idea is let's have uh, JFK and Nixon go on TV, this new ish invention that everyone's addicted to, like you guys and your cell phones. Anyway, let's have uh, let's have the political parties kind of define what they are. And remember, they're not super far apart at this time period. I'm sure someone that lived through this time period would say, "Oh my goodness, they're super far apart. You're crazy, Mullen." But like living in the future where we see how far apart the political parties are now, looking back, they don't seem so drastically far apart, especially when you remember they're in the middle of that switch. Now, Nixon is he went to Harvard, played football by the way, but he wasn't any good. It always bothered him. But anyway, Nixon is very studious. He's going to spend the next couple of months, not months, sorry, weeks preparing for this debate. He studies in the library. He has practice debates. He's up all night the night before, and he has a little bit of a cold, almost like Mullen right now. Hmm. JFK, on the other hand, is really not going to be super prepared. He is going to spend the day at the beach with his kids, and he has a nice little tan. Got some vitamin D at the beach. He also has three different hairdressers. Now, what's fascinating about this debate is that about half-ish of America listened to it on the radio, and about half of America watched it on TV. The half that listened to it on the radio are convinced that Nixon won. But the half that watched it on TV are convinced that JFK won. The basic moral of the story is that even though Nixon gave all the right answers, JFK looked better while doing it. And when the election happens a couple of weeks, days later, I don't know, I don't have my notes in front of me. But when the election happens, uh, the election is extremely close. In fact, it's when it comes to the popular vote, the closest election in American history. There's only like 120,000 votes that separate JFK and Nixon. Nixon is going to lose because JFK was prettier on TV. Kind of makes Nixon go a little crazy. Can you imagine being the most qualified candidate up there, having an amazing, uh, political record, and then you lose just because you're not cute? Hmm. Kind of weird how many of our presidents have like body image issues, isn't it? Anyway, that's another story. So now JFK is president. Now, him being president is going to basically kind of explain the youthful movement in America, but also like this exuberance and looking towards the future. Kennedy is going to start. He starts a new military group called the Green Berets. He does the Peace Corps. This idea of Americans going and volunteering their time at great personal expense, both in time and in money, to go help out people around the world. This is kind of like the motto of JFK, and it kind of shows a different take on what an American can be. He even says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That is a terrible JFK impression. But anyway, that's kind of the idea of this time period. Um, and it's funny, again, because the guy could barely walk and he couldn't put on his own socks, but he is going to be a representative of this youth movement. Of the many goals that Kennedy comes up with, one of the big ones is to have America win the space race. Now, as you guys know, the Russians have launched Sputnik back in 1957, so the plan of the United States is to, I don't know, beat them in a race that we don't even have equipment for. It's almost like we're going to challenge Mr. Yip to a marathon, but we haven't learned to walk yet. That's essentially what this is like. And we're going to spend a whole bunch of money trying to build up our space agency as a way of uh, getting to the moon first. Now, it's not so much the moon has any special deep significance, like, scientifically, and there's a reason why we don't really go back there. But the idea here is to show the international prestige of how great our culture and science is. But at the same time, remember, the other reason why you want to learn how to build rockets is so that way you can launch a missile further and more accurately. So even though we say the goal is to go to the moon, the implication is clear. We also kind of want to be able to bomb Moscow. but that's another story. Okay, so JFK becomes president and he's going to make a big mistake. The mistake is called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Here's the basic story. The CIA walks into Kennedy's office like the first couple of weeks on the job and says, "Hey, bro, just so you know, Eisenhower went ahead and approved this military plan. Why don't you go ahead and sign off on it and we'll be good to go?" JFK, being relatively young, inexperienced, and I mean, again, if Eisenhower approved this, the dude that did the whole, winning of World War II says this is good to go. Well, then we're gonna assume it's good to go. Anyway, uh, the plan is horrible. We're going to take Cuban exiles that live in Florida and then give them guns, send them to Cuba to assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, wait a minute, who's Fidel Castro? Okay, so uh, go back to our containment formula that we talked about a couple weeks ago. Basically, there's going to be a civil war in Cuba, the communists win, and Fidel Castro is that communist leader, which means our closest non touching neighbor has fallen to communism. Obviously, we're not going to want this guy to be in power, and we're going to try like multiple times to assassinate this dude over the years, and like he just will not die. Anyway, in this attempt, it's going to fail miserably for a series of reasons that aren't really worth our time. It fails miserably. And it makes America look like stupid on the world stage. But you got to give Kennedy credit because Kennedy is going to go in front of the American public and say, hey, look, I completely screwed up. I made a horrible mistake. This is all my fault. And I won't allow this to happen in the future. In fact, he also says, you can read that on your own. Because if I read it to you, I'll start my JFK impression. Go ahead and pause the video, that way you can give that a read through. This is an example of solid leadership. Moving on. Okay, fast forward a couple of months, maybe years, and uh, the Cubans have asked the Soviets for protection. Oh, we can't trust the United States because the United States is trying to attack us and kill our leader. Babies. Anyway, they asked the Soviets for help and assistance, and the Soviets are going to say, "Ja, we got you, bro." So they put a bunch of missiles in Cuba, and those missiles are pointed right towards the United States. Now remember, the United States has been relatively safe from a Soviet attack because we're like 8,000 miles away. But now it's less than 800 miles from Cuba to Washington, D.C. The Soviets might not have been able to launch a nuke 8,000 miles, but they can probably launch at 800. So this has basically taken away our sense of security. And now we're going to begin a huge fight between Nikita Khrushchev, who of course is the new Soviet premier, and JFK. It's going to be a tense 13 days, as it is known as, where the U.S. tells the Soviets to get rid of the nukes or else we'll blow them up. Remember, we have mutually assured destruction, we have brinksmanship, we have the total annihilation capabilities for both countries to destroy the other, and we basically tell them, hey, look, if you don't get rid of those nukes, we will start this nuclear war. And the Soviets say the same thing back to us, and it becomes a very tense 13 days. At the very last moment, the Soviets back down, thank goodness. Uh, and this goes down as a great success during JFK's presidency. And actually, it makes Nikita Khrushchev look like a miserable failure in the Soviet Union. He's eventually going to be deposed, but that's a story for another day and another class. AP Soviet Union. You all take the test collectively, and you all fail. Ha 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 ha. Oh yeah, you could read that too. That's another fun fact. I probably should have edited this PowerPoint before I decided to do a video lecture over it. Oh well. Okay, so it's now 1963, and JFK is going to get assassinated. Again, because I don't want this video to be flagged as some sort of a conspiracy video, I'm going to go ahead and just tell the briefest version of this story. Essentially, JFK is in Dallas. He's in Texas trying to start his reelection campaign in November of 1963. He is going to go on a publicized parade route in an open air carriage, and he's not wearing a hat. Big mistake. And this dude is going to happen to be working along this parade route. His name is Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald's a little crazy, and he decides that, well, one, he would rather be someone living in the Soviet Union, but two, uh, that he is going to kill the president of the United States to prove his worth to the Soviets. It's kind of a weird deal. Long story short, JFK gets shot, and this is going to cause absolute chaos in America. There's a lot of conspiracies behind it. Again, there's probably plenty of videos on YouTube about those conspiracies that I don't want this to be attached to, so I'm going to go ahead and not talk about any of that. But the Supreme Court is going to, or sorry, the Warren Commission, which is going to be led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, is going to look into the assassination and basically say, you know what, it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Lucky series of shots. There's more to it than that, but again, I don't want this video to get flagged, even though it's for educational purposes, so I am going to move on. So, what happens in the wake of JFK's death? This is going to sound very morbid and horrible, but like, if you want to capitalize on the death of a president and the assassination of a president, you got to have someone that is good at legislation. Congress is difficult to work with, but they're going to be a little, what's the word? I can't think of the word. I want to say like amenable, but it doesn't sound right. Anyway, basically, the country's going to want to get some work done, to mourn the death of a president, and we need a new president that's going to be good at working with Congress to get those things done. Lyndon Baines Johnson is that guy. Johnson is tall and imposing, and he's actually very intimidating. You can see here in these pictures on the left what he would do as he worked and negotiated with Congress. He would get very close into your personal space, and he would actually start like kicking you in the shin while smiling you smiling you in the face. He'd be in your personal space, smiling at you while kicking you in the shin, saying, "You agree with me, right? You're gonna get this done, right?" And he's a super big, tall, and imposing Texan. Um, so you can imagine that he's going to be pretty good at getting some legislation done. And this is exactly what the country needs. I know it's morbid, but it's what the country needs at this time period. Essentially, he's going to be the best one to capitalize on the death of JFK. By the way, you can see Jackie Kennedy pictured there. Johnson wanted to make sure that Jackie Kennedy was nearby, um, just so that way, the country would have the support of him. This is a crazy transition of power. So let's see what LBJ, enough acronyms, let's see what he does with this newfound power. He decides that he wants to start what's known as the Great Society. Turns out we have a huge poverty problem in America. Something like 25%, maybe even 50% of Americans are going to be of a low socioeconomic status and are struggling with poverty. And because of the poverty epidemic, it makes it very difficult for the country to, uh, basically progress. Again, your book will go into a lot more detail as like what's going on with poverty. It'll connect it to white flight and connect it to other issues. But the basic premise here is that a majority of Americans are struggling, and the government kind of takes it upon themselves to help solve these problems. We've discussed the poverty cycle before, and the idea of the poverty cycle is that it's nearly impossible to break on your own. You need some sort of outside assistance to break the poverty cycle. And Johnson's War on Poverty, or the Great Society, is going to be created basically for that purpose. The idea is going to be that the government is going to help people break out of the poverty cycle. Now, there's going to be several ways to get it done. You can see the programs listed here. Things like the Office of Equal Opportunity is going to make it easier for people of marginalized groups to get jobs and make it easier for them to get housing. Speaking of the Department of Housing Development, we'll get to that in a second. But at this time period, it's difficult for non-white people to get housing or to get loans or to get jobs. So the idea is the government's going to basically force businesses to ease restrictions that they have on marginalized groups to make it easier for them to be able to help themselves. Basically, it's not a big mistake when you look at the Great Society or War on Poverty. It's not just the government giving money to people saying, hey, okay, make your life better. It's going to be giving people opportunities. That way they have the option of making their life better. An example of this would be the Department of Housing and Development. The idea here is that the cities of America have become extremely run down. And they basically become like slums. So the idea of the Department of Housing and Development is let's have the government spend a bunch of money in improving the cities. Remember we talked about white flight and the lack of tax revenue in the cities? Well, the government is basically going to reinvest in the cities. And the plan here is that through reinvesting in the cities and improving them, it will improve the lives of the people that are living there, which in this case are mostly minorities, again, because of white flight. Um, and the logic here is that if the region is improved, the crime rates will go down, the job opportunities will come back if the region is improved. Turns out people don't like to be hanging out and spending money in places that aren't safe. I'd normally make a Fontana joke here, but I've been told to stop making fun of Fontana, so make your own Fontana joke. Okay, so another program that Johnson and the government are going to propose is going to be called the Head Start program. I'm going to go ahead and guess that most of you went to preschool. Turns out that students that go to preschool are more successful throughout the rest of their academic careers. But preschool is not funded by the government. Preschool is privately funded, basically by your parents. If you went to preschool, it was probably because of your parents. By the way, if you hear any panting, that's not me, that's my dog. She just decided to come sit next to me. Hi, Gidget. Hi, little girl. Yeah, she's been ignoring me for half an hour while I record this, but now she's decided to come here and distract me as I'm trying to give an important lecture to students. Want to say hi to the students? Hi, students. How's it going? You better ace this test. Anyway, that's how she talks. The Head Start program is going to give government funding to make it so that way people of a lower socioeconomic status are going to be able to go to preschool. That way they'll be better off in school. And again, the logic here is that yes, does this program have some cost? Yeah. But if it improves graduation rates and improves education rates among marginalized groups, then they will be able to get higher paying jobs and pay more taxes. Essentially, this is the government investing in itself in a roundabout way. Finally, the Great Society is also going to have a uh, intentional idea of making sure that the elderly or the sick or the mentally or physically disabled would have access to health care. We've already talked about Social Security. Well, the next big step in that is going to be this idea known as Medicare. As people live longer and basically fall apart, they're going to have bigger medical expenses. So the idea of Medicare is that after a certain age, the government basically will fund your insurance. That way, not only can you retire, but you can also not go into horrible debt for medical issues. Medicare is a national program. Medicaid is basically also national but run by the states. Medicare is for the elderly, and Medicaid is for the physically or mentally unfit to work. And the idea is that they should get health care. That way, everyone should be able to get health care. That way, they will be able to live a happier life. Now, the Great Society cost a lot of money. Your textbook will go into more detail, and if I had my notes in front of me, I would go into more detail too. But I don't. So you'll just have to look up those numbers yourself. The Great Society is very expensive, and it's actually relatively successful. The problem is the Great Society doesn't stick around for very long because America is going to get distracted by something known as the Vietnam War. But that's another chapter. Oh, yep. Oh, hey, look, my dog almost fell off the couch and screamed. So that's good. Okay, so chaos. So, little girl, you need to stay on the couch and not go jumping around. Ugh. Anyway, I promise you I am not torturing my dog. I promise. She's just crazy. So, let's talk about your chapter is going to end by discussing the expansion of the civil rights movement. Now, technically, we already kind of mentioned this in class, but who knows when you're listening to this, you probably forgot. Let's briefly talk about each group and how they're going to use the stuff from the civil rights movement to get their rights as well. Because the 60s and 70s, the story of them are going to be previously marginalized people trying to get their rights from the government and from society, etc., etc. So let's just see how this is done. We'll start with a return to feminism. That's right. Dr. Pepper might be a woman, and you've never thought about that before. You've also never heard a woman give a voiceover in a movie trailer. Hmm. Now, it's funny I keep saying now. Anyway, the women's rights movement is going to really grow in the 60s and 70s. Basically, there's going to be a return to feminism. Now, we've kind of already talked about this when we talked about Betty Friedan and we talked about the feminine mystique. But now, the generation that grew up reading that book, now they're a little bit older, and they're going to be fighting more for their rights. The National Organization of Women at this time period is going to be basically fighting for women's, specifically their working rights. The idea of that women should get paid equal amounts for equal work, and that women should have equal educational opportunities and work opportunities. Remember, at this time period in the 60s and 70s, most women couldn't do more than become teachers, gross, or secretaries. So the idea of now is that women should get the educational opportunities to pursue other career interests and that they should be able to get other career interests. Now, another big thing at this time period is going to be a very famous Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail because I don't want this video to get flagged. Feel free to look it up on your own. The basic idea here is, should a woman have the right to privacy over her own body, specifically in regards to an abortion? The government is going to rule, sorry, the Supreme Court is going to rule that a woman should have control over her own body. Again, there's way more to it, but it's a dicey subject, and I don't want this video to get flagged by YouTube, so I am just going to go ahead and move on. Oh, well, that's going to make it so that way we don't get flagged by YouTube too. The gay rights movement is also going to grow and expand during this time period. Again, your book will talk a little bit about a couple of significant events, but the basic idea here is that the homosexual movement should be able to have the same rights and freedoms as anyone else. We talked before about the lavender scare, which made it so that way homosexuals couldn't work in the government. That's going to exist until the 1970s. And a big part of the gay rights movement is that the homosexual community shouldn't be marginalized or lacking in job or career opportunities because of their sexual orientation. And the gay rights movement is going to use many of the same strategies from the civil rights movement to bring awareness to the issue and to demand a change. It's a long and slow process. Really, it's not until the mid to late 2010s that things start to really improve legally for the gay rights community, specifically when it comes to marriage. But the basic premise here is that the gay rights community is going to start a series of protest marches and voting campaigns, just like the civil rights movement did, to fight for their rights. Latinos, same basic premise here. There are going to be a lot of Latinos, specifically in the American Southwest, that are going to be just as marginalized as the black community was in the American South. Uh, there's a concept here known as de facto segregation versus de jure segregation. If you haven't gone to law school yet, de facto means like it's happening anyway, and de jure means by law. So in California, we don't have de jure segregation. We have de facto, which basically means that even though it's not officially on the record books as the law, it's happening anyway. Cesar Chavez, you may have seen some roads named after him. Cesar Chavez is going to push for Latino Americans, specifically in the farming community, to get paid better and to have better working conditions. He does a series of boycotts. You can see that's Robert Kennedy, I believe, signing a protest, like rally, I guess you could say, document. And the basic premise here is that the Latino community farms most of the food that Americans eat, and they get paid next to nothing. So, the idea of Chavez is that the Latino community should stop working. That way, Americans run out of food and they realize how vital the labor of the Latino community is. This movement is going to be relatively successful at bringing more awareness to the Latino community and helping them get better pay for their work. Citizenship is going to be another story that we don't really have time for. So, moving on. Finally, there's going to be a red power movement. Native Americans are going to basically say, hey, we're also being mistreated as well. Um, I have made it a special focus of this class to talk about Native American history, but really, up until this time period, Native American history is not really discussed in any history classrooms. It's only become a bigger part of the narrative of history that we historians tell in the last couple of years. So, the reason why there is more of a focus on Native American history is because of what's known as the Red Power movement. Exact same ideas as the Civil Rights movement. The idea being that this is a group of people that have been marginalized and forgotten by history and that are living really kind of difficult lives. Um, Life expectancy in America is worse if you are a Native American. Alcoholism and poverty rates are the worst of any other group for Native Americans. So the idea here is that the Native American community needs to get more respect and job opportunities and help from the rest of America. We talked about the 1950s being a period of conformity and everyone's trying to act the same way and white flight. The thing is, all of these other people are left behind and they are going to be demanding their rights. Okay, that is the end of our story. I can't believe I did all of that without any notes in front of me. Before you guys go off in the comments, which I will turn off anyway, but before you guys send protest letters to the school that I work at, assuming you're not from my school, just know that one, this is off the top of my head. Two, I'm doing this to help the students learn the material. Three, I am not a acclaimed historian of record of this time period. There are plenty of other books which I encourage you to read, especially your textbook about this time period. So I hope you guys all have a excellent whatever this is. I am recording this in 2020, by the way, for all of our future historians. Um, so yeah, I hope you guys are having a great quarantine. Say hi to your families, say hi to your friends, just not like, in person. And hopefully I'll get to see you guys all soon. Bye.